So, let's start with just a kind of interesting comparison, and I think it's worth revisiting because the parallels have gotten, even more intensified. But we wrote a piece a while ago, a couple years ago, comparing Turkey's Erdogan government and the AKP party and the modern Republican Party in terms of this synergy between this deep conspiratorial mindset that goes to the highest reaches of government, and actual, primarily in the United States, we focus on legislative action across the country, from Arizona to South Dakota to Washington State, to really essentially make protesting and certainly, nonviolent civil disobedience, illegal, something you could be held, could turn, turn someone to financial ruin, potentially allowing people, and we've seen in the past several weeks, these, horrifying car attacks that people have done driving into protesters across the United States. And I, especially in light of Bolton's book, and we'll get to Bolton later, and you will never catch us praising John Bolton for a split second. But he does write a bit about, has some gossip, among other things, about the Trump-Erdogan relationship. I wanted to kind of revisit that. So can you sort of map out some of the parallels there for us?
Yeah, I think the piece that we wrote in 2017, unfortunately, has held up pretty well, as the Trump administration has progressed. I think, obviously sometimes comparisons between different countries can be quite trite and superficial, but I do think there are some significant comparisons to be made, especially in terms of the way that the Trump administration and the Erdogan administration sort of envisaged themselves, the way that despite holding the levers of power, they still present themselves as some kind of embattled minority. In the United States, the term deep state, for example, has become common currency especially amongst the political right. Now, the concept itself of a deep state is actually a perfectly reasonable concept, but the way that is obviously mobilized on the political right in the United States is in this conspiratorial manner, these sort of cabals behind the scenes. Now, this terminology, deep state, although there are precedents to it across the world, comes from Turkey. There's a concept known as the derin devleti, which is the deep state, which referred to the relationships between far right groups, mafia groups within the military, and particularly became relevant during the conflict with the PKK in Turkey's Kurdish areas as well. And so, this concept, birthed numerous conspiracy theories. So, the AKP often sort of, especially early on during its reign, pitched itself as being against this deep state cabal. And, we're seeing a similar kind of discourse in the United States. Erdogan repeats conspiracy theories about plots to undermine Turkey, both from within and without. More recently, we've sort of seen a focus in Turkey towards looking at, anyone who opposes him is a follower of Fethullah Gulen, who is this religious leader who lives in Pennsylvania and who was once an ally of Erdogan and who, helped Erdogan attack some of those entrenched interests within the Turkish state. But later, there was a conflict between those two, and he became public enemy number one. So, we see this sort of conspiratorial politics, going on in Turkey and sort of metamorphosizing, over time, different enemies appear. But the core element is that there is a conspiracy. The Trump administration, we see a similar thing. We see an ongoing sort of attempt to present the Donald Trump as this embattled figure who is, fighting against these secretive cabals. Just look at the popularity of the QAnon phenomena in the United States. It's an absolutely barking mad conspiracy theory, yet it holds an enormous amount of currency. You go to Turkey, amongst AKP supporters, and not only supporters of AKP, but generally within the broader population, there are enormous amount of conspiracy theories about various groups: the Catholic Church, the Freemasons, the Israeli lobby. These are all conspiring to undermine Erdogan and stop Turkey becoming a great power. Just as in the United States, we have all the Trump administration and followers of Donald Trump are always trying to present these internal and external threats as working to undermine the Trump administration, often as a way to explain away the incompetence or the political mistakes made by the regime. So when something bad happens, it's not because of a bad policy, it's because somebody behind the scenes has been pulling the strings. George Soros is a common boogeyman on the American right, and also in Turkey. In Turkey, George Soros has long been seen as this pernicious individual who seeks to undermine the country. So we see these kind of overlaps in this conspiratorial style of politics.
And in actual, legislative action. I think that's really important to highlight.
Yeah, I think definitely when we look at the way that the Trump administration has been, and more broadly, I think this was
the Republican Party.
The Republican Party. It's very easy to pick on Trump because he's uncouth and he's not, he doesn't conform to what we are used to as a politician. And, in some ways, comparing him with Erdogan is a little bit unfair because Erdogan has some kind of basic competence in managing politics. But, the Republican Party in general has, and we've seen this as has been trying to make it more difficult for people to protest. In Turkey as well, we see the government. Just recently there was, in response to the arrest of some members of the HDP, the pro-Kurdish left-wing party in Turkey, there was an attempt to organize a protest. And, that protest was banned by the Turkish authorities on various grounds, including, a public health grounds that COVID-19 was going to would be dangerous. So we see the sort of cynical use of bureaucratic measures to make protests more difficult. We see the extensive use of police violence. Now, of course, police violence in Turkey is, so much more overt than in the United States. But, we're
so if you're watching the opening package of today's show, it gets more and more overt by the day in the United States. And of course, for specific targeted populations, it always has been in the United States. But do you think, actually, the thing that gets complicated, though, is, so on one hand, too, of course, and maybe there's an awkward parallel here as well, but, Joe Biden, as an example, is interested in sort of, implementing kind of like federal terrorism guidelines, which would actually have made, as an example, Trump's huffing and puffing about Antifa infinitely more dangerous if that bill, that Biden had put forward was on the books. Bill Clinton signed the Effectiveness and Death Penalty Act in the mid-1990s. So, again, it's another one of these conversations where it's absolutely both sides, and it is a bipartisan effort. Now, the Republicans are undeniably at more extremes, and, drawing kind of facile, pure parallels is silly, and we reject that. But there is a systems problem in place. And also related to that, even the discourse, as you pointed out, and maybe you could elaborate, deep state is a very valid conceptual frame, certainly in Turkey. I would say definitely also in the United States, if you consider everything from a permanent lobbying class to absolutely a military industrial intelligence complex that absolutely runs U.S. foreign policy in a bipartisan fashion. There's no question about it, and does have permanent governing interests. So in the discourse, I've noticed, especially with the advent of the sort of like right-wing kind of mainstreaming of weaponized conspiracy theory culture, It's always been there. Alex Jones, Rush Limbaugh, whatever, but now in Fox News. But, it wasn't, George W. Bush was lying about WMDs, but he wasn't saying, the reason the WMDs aren't there is because there's, an NSA cabal with, like Oprah and George Soros that is trying to embarrass me or something. Right. And so the response of the kind of resistance types has been, well, let's discount, let's just, just the facts, ma'am. And that has actually turned into a completely craven and, ridiculous belief and trust in, the military and the intelligence apparatus. We'll get to John Bolton later. Anytime, any thug steps out and says the obvious about Donald Trump, they're hailed as a hero. So, and maybe we can kind of conflate these two questions, but how do we strike the critical balance while we track the changes that have happened in Trump's America or Erdogan's Turkey, but then not just sort of revert to a kind of ridiculous, like, the governing institutions are just fine. There isn't structural, brutal corruption. The last thing I'll add is, it's like, yes, I think there's no doubt. Obviously, we see that with, the kind of embarrassment of so much of Russiagate. Of course, there were elements of the United States kind of permanent governing class that did not like Donald Trump. Now, the more substantive thing, though, to note is that he gave them substantively everything that they wanted in terms of, no limits on drone strikes, continuing with Democratic support to amp up the Patriot Act. Anyways, just how do we have this analysis and disaggregate the conspiracy theorizing and the repression and the unique danger of that as exemplified by these right-wing authoritarians, while not going back to this very silly, diluted, dangerous, simplistic discourse on just kind of blind institutional trust?
Sure. I mean, I think you strike at a very important point there. I think one of the reasons that the right-wing critique and the right-wing narrative is so powerful is because it touches on an element of truth. There is and there are, deep interests in the United States. As you mentioned, you have the national security state, the lobbyists, the civil service, and so on. In Turkey, you had a military that basically, up until the early 2000s, had veto power over the Turkish government that could operate any type of sort of action that it wanted behind the scenes. There was the, coups nearly every 10 years and so on and so forth. So when that discourse about conspiracy comes into the mainstream, it resonates because people do see that there are elements of truth to it. I mean, I think in general, when we look at, conservative politics, they're very good at weaponizing liberal hypocrisy. So, there are entrenched interests, and liberals, in response to Trump's criticism, is not to say, well, there is a point, but is to be completely partisan and just rage on about how bad Donald Trump is, in a way to kind of, I guess, avoid broader structural critiques of the society. I mean, a good example of this, you mentioned how in the United States, some of the authoritarian shifts in American politics have been, at least, the Democratic Party has failed to really stand up to those shifts, and at times has been complicit in those shifts. The same can be applied to Turkey. If we look at the main opposition party, the Republican People's Party, one of the big shifts just before the 2016 coup attempt was to remove parliamentary immunity. Now, obviously, parliamentary immunity does mean that, politicians in Turkey could get away with corruption, but it also acted as an important check in a system which is very majoritarian on the governing party banning the opposition. Now, when just before the coup, the AKP put forward laws stripping MPs of parliamentary immunity, a move directed at the HDP, the pro-Kurdish party, well, the Republican People's Party signed on to that. And now that law is being used against them. So rather than sort of standing up to that authoritarianism, they buy into parts of the narrative and basically become nursemaids to this authoritarian shift. And this is one of the really important things to understand about the Democratic Party. It's all wonderful to be criticizing, Trump's excessive use of violence, but if you're signing off on huge spending increases in the military, or not putting a check on the Patriot Act, then what are you doing? A lot of the stuff that opposition politicians do in the United States is performative. Like, for example, we saw all the Democrats in the Congress wearing an African dress and taking a knee. I mean, this was ridiculous. It looked like there was some kind of, School of Oriental and African Studies anthropology professor going to meet a Nigerian prince in the 1930s, acting all ridiculously in that manner. So not doing their job and purely focusing on symbolic issues. Again, in Turkey, there was a lot of hoofing and hawing amongst the sort of traditional Kemalist right of the country, the nationalists, about symbols, complaining about, oh no, girls with headscarves are allowed to go to university now, focusing on those issues rather than, paying attention to actual authoritarian shifts in governing policy. And it comes back to bite them because, those laws that they sign off on, well, they're eventually going to be turned on them.
Two quick things before we get to the sort of formalization or the formalization of apartheid in Israel with the annexation. Tell us first, I want to remind everybody of the Flynn story, but first, can you talk about the HDP and the political prisoners and what the HDP represents?
Sure. So when we look at Turkish politics, the dominant political party for the last 2 decades almost has been the Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, which began as a kind of conservative party, but it has now increasingly become Erdogan's sort of personal vehicle. And then you had an opposition party, the Republican People's Party, which claims the mantle of Ataturk, which is nominally on the left, but is more nationalistic. Now, in recent years, we've seen the rise of the HDP, which comes out of sort of the parliamentary wing of the Kurdish movement. But what has happened over the last couple of years, it's endeavored to move away from being a purely sort of Kurdish interest party to being a broader social democratic party under the leadership of Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ. The party and Figen Yüksekdağ is Turkish, not Kurdish. The party has sort of moved to being more of a Syriza or a Corbynite Labour or something like that, and has sought to sort of build an intersectional politics which brings together not only Kurds but labor movements, LGBTQ movements, other sort of soft left groups and things like that. And in 2015, they had an enormous success in the election because they scored over 10% of the national vote, which allowed them to enter parliament as directly. There's a very complicated discussion we don't need to get into about electoral politics in Turkey, but this was a big win, and this undermined the AKP. So what we've seen since 2015 is a ramping up of the conflict with the Kurds, both inside Turkey, where we've seen the progressive sort of removal of Kurdish mayors in the predominantly Kurdish regions of Turkey, the arrest of Demirtas, who's in prison, and a sort of ongoing campaign, which continues to this day, of arresting AKP members, while at the same time trying to sort of ramp up conflict with the Kurds, to sort of exacerbate that conflict, not only repressing Kurds within Turkey, but launching attacks over in international borders. In the 90s, Turkey launched operations against the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Iraq. That's not a new thing. But that was done by the military with a kind of national security logic. The AKP now is launching these attacks, not so much with a national security logic, but with a political propaganda logic to drive a wedge between the HDP and other members of the Turkish opposition, and to hopefully, when the new elections come, to drive the HDP down below the 10% electoral threshold, and ensure that AKP picks up those seats in the southeast to consolidate its position. So right now, Turkey is launching a very bloody attack into Iraq, attacking Yazidi villages, killing people. They recently killed an Iraqi Kurdish off-duty officer, and this is not because they believe they're going to wipe out the PKK, but because it provides that kind of ongoing nationalistic hostility that the AKP is sort of able to feed upon in order to sort of break the opposition apart.
Absolutely. And that's those political prisoners are definitely political prisoners that are very important to have solidarity with and awareness of. And there's a real significance to the HDP in the region and globally. Remind us of Michael Flynn's relationship to the Erdogan government and Fethullah Gulen.
Yeah, so Michael Flynn, and I don't know if people remember this, but if you're a Turkey follower, you will remember this. On the day of the election of Donald Trump, The Hill published an article from Michael Flynn in which he basically regurgitated the Turkish government's line about Fethullah Gulen, this religious leader, saying that he's a kind of terrorist and the United States should be involved in suppressing him and extraditing him. And there was a plot, for example, that Flynn and his son were apparently thinking about kidnapping Fethullah Gulen from his sort of compound in Pennsylvania and renditioning him to Turkey. Utterly bizarre and crazy stuff. But of course, Flynn was on the payroll of the Turkish government. I mean, we have, the Turkish government has been chucking around money in Washington. People focus on Russia. And I think the lesson from Russia is not so much like there's this evil sort of conspiracy theory, but it's like if you have a political system where, you can just deploy unlimited money, don't be surprised if foreign money is going to turn up and start trying to do the same thing as domestic lobby groups do. And Turkey is one of those countries. Not only Flynn was having close relations with Turkey, but Rudy Giuliani had close relations with Turkey. Turkey hired a lobbying group that with close ties to the Trump administration. And Turkey actually produces propaganda directly for the consumption of Donald Trump. One of the recent things they've done, TRT World.
I shouldn't laugh. I'm sorry.
Published a video saying how the Kurds in Syria were working with Antifa and training Antifa fighters to return back to the United States and overthrow the American government. It's utterly... And
Glenn Beck ran with this. We played it yesterday.
Oh, Glenn Beck ran with it? Yeah, well, I'm not surprised. So, there's actually, Turkey has a lot of, has a lot of fingers in the administration. Flynn is only one part of the puzzle. I mean, so it's a very strange story that sort of reaches to the highest levels of the U.S. government, and obviously causes tension because within the conservative movement, there is deep hostility in some quarters towards Turkey. I follow right-wing news quite a lot, and you have people like Mark Levin, who's a total crazy, right? He's very anti-Erdogan, sees him as like some kind of Islamist. But there's this faction which is getting paid, which sort of buys into the Turkish narrative that actually Turkey is this country in the bulwark against sort of radicalism and radical leftism and things like that. So this is a really strange situation. And what Bolton's book is, and we'll come on to this. Bolton talks about Trump's sort of affinity towards him and Trump's attempt to intervene in court cases that had implicated Turkey in particular crimes in the United States. I mean, one of the great ironies is, there was a court case where a Turkish Iranian gold trader and a Turkish bank, Halkbank, were, sanction bustings with Iran, right? And, I'm not surprised Bolton brought this up because, of course, we all know Bolton is probably crying into his soup about not being able to massacre Iranians. But, Trump missed the maximum pressure on Iran at the same time as telling Erdogan, don't worry, I'm going to handle this $20 billion sanction busting operation that Turkey was going on with as well, and attempting to use that as some kind of leverage within his relationship with Erdogan. I mean, and it seems Erdogan is pretty good at sort of, I don't like to get into sort of psychological understandings of politics too much, but
he knows how to play Trump.
Yeah,
I mean, he clearly does.
He knows how to,
he alphas Trump.
He alphas Trump.
He definitely alphas Trump.
Trump is what Trump is just doesn't have the same sort of street thug politics of Erdogan. Although
Erdogan came from something, and Erdogan, Erdogan is a thug in the full use of that word, but first of all, not in a pretend, thug, and a very intelligent one, unfortunately, for the Turkish and Kurdish people in the main. But his capacity is right up there, interpersonally, and they all have different styles. But Modi's very good at it, as an example, in a completely different way. It's very interesting to watch, these right wing sort of authoritarian types. The Modis, the Putins, the Erdogans, who have actual political capacity. And then, of course, Trump, Trump feels comfortable, Boris Johnson's a jackass, and, Bolsonaro is just absolutely pathetic in his, elevation of Trump. And so Trump will unfollow him on Twitter as things go poorly for Bolsonaro, which is absolutely hysterical. And but when it comes to, the guys that have, and I should keep saying, like, unfortunately, God, even she is an able operator, and, Trump builds a whole brand on xenophobia and fear mongering. And then on the other hand, clearly is just sort of, submitted to the guy. Anyways,